An empath doesn't become avoidant out of coldness. They become avoidant out of exhaustion. And that's the part people never understand. Empaths don't wake up one day and decide to shut down. They don't switch roles because they suddenly lost interest or because their heart hardened. They switch because the weight they've been carrying quietly, consistently, without complaint, finally becomes too heavy to hold alone. Empaths absorb, soothe, repair, and stabilize until their own nervous system begins to fray. They keep showing up even when every sign tells them they shouldn't. They keep loving past the point of logic, past the point of self-preservation, past the point where the relationship is emotionally reciprocal. And eventually, after too many cycles of being the emotional anchor, burnout doesn't just visit, it moves in. It rewrites their capacity, their tolerance, their willingness to keep choosing someone who makes them feel alone while together. That's when the empath becomes something they never imagined, the person who pulls away. It's not rejection, it's not revenge, it's not manipulation, it's the final stage of emotional fatigue. The kind that comes from carrying a connection that was supposed to be mutual, but turned into a one-sided responsibility. Empaths don't become avoidant because they want distance. They become avoidant because they've run out of ways to stay. There's a point where their heart says, I can't fix this anymore. And their body follows. That's when the silence begins, not as a punishment, but as a form of self-protection. They should have learned sooner but didn't, because empathy teaches them to overgive before it teaches them to defend themselves. The role reversal happens slowly at first. The empath stops initiating conversations, not out of spite, but because constant initiating has become a form of emotional self-harm. They stop over-explaining their feelings, not because they're hiding anything, but because they're tired of being the only one emotionally fluent. They stop trying to decode mixed signals because they realize that clarity is not something you have to beg for. They stop fighting for the relationship and start fighting for their peace. And that shift, that quiet withdrawal of energy, feels like avoidance, but it's really self-rescue. Burnout teaches the empath what boundaries never could. It teaches them to step back instead of step forward, to observe instead of absorb, to detach instead of overextend. And the most painful part is that this transformation is never dramatic. It's subtle, calm, almost eerily peaceful. The empath doesn't storm out, they fade. They don't slam doors, they simply stop reopening them. They don't announce they're done, they just stop trying to hold together a connection that fell apart every time they loosen their grip. When an empath becomes avoidant, it's not a personality change, it's a survival strategy. It's the moment they choose themselves after choosing someone else for far too long. And that silence, that distance, that withdrawal, it isn't about coldness. It's about finally recognizing that love shouldn't feel like carrying the entire relationship alone. It's exhaustion disguised as detachment. It's self-protection mistaken for indifference. And it's the clearest sign the empath has reached their limit. The moment the empath gets tired, the avoidant finally feels what distance truly tastes like. Empaths aren't the ones who run first. They're the ones who stay long after their heart has started, whispering warnings. They endure the push-pull, the mixed signals, the emotional shutdowns, the moments where it feels like they're loving for two. They stay because they believe in potential, in softness, in understanding. But endurance has limits, even for the strongest heart. And when an empath finally reaches that threshold, when their nervous system is overstimulated, overextended, and overwhelmed, their silence carries a different energy. It's no longer the kind of silence that waits, it's the kind that withdraws. The silence is not a strategy, it's not a power move, it's not revenge or a manipulation tactic, it's the body protecting itself after being stretched too thin. Empaths don't choose distance lightly, it comes only after every effort to connect has been met with avoidance, deflection, or emotional absence. The empath's silence isn't empty, it's full of everything they didn't want to say out loud. I'm tired of being the only one holding the emotional thread, and the moment that silence arrives, everything shifts. For the avoidant, this is the first time they taste their own medicine, but not in the petty, tit-for-tat way people imagine. It's the first time they feel the absence of reassurance, the lack of emotional cushioning, the loss of someone who always softened the edges. Avoidants are used to space. They create it. They rely on it. They hide inside it. But they've never truly felt it. Not the way the empath's silence delivers it. Their own distance was controlled, predictable, safe. The empath's distance It feels like losing a home they didn't realize they were living in. This is the moment the avoidant begins to feel something unfamiliar, the ache of missing someone who used to do the emotional work for them. The avoidant starts noticing the quiet, the lack of check ins, the absence of warmth, and that stillness becomes a mirror, showing them the very behaviors they once justified as needing space. But now that space feels cold. It feels sharp. It feels like the consequence of not stepping forward when it matters. Empaths get tired in a way. Avoidants never expect. They carry so much for so long that when they finally set it down, the loss is seismic. The avoidant feels the shift not because the empath is punishing them, but because the empath is no longer buffering the emotional distance between them. The avoidant must now face the reality of the connection without the empath's constant effort holding it upright. And for the first time, they feel what it's like to be the one on the outside looking in. That's when something unexpected happens. The avoidant, the one who once ran from closeness, begins to feel the urge to move toward it. Not because they've suddenly become secure, but because the empath's withdrawal removes the safety net they took for granted. Suddenly, the dynamic flips. The avoidant realizes, it's my turn to chase. And that realization hits harder than any silence ever could.
They didn't become avoidant, they became unavailable to people who took their availability for granted.
This is the truth no one wants to acknowledge. Empaths don't wake up one day cold, shut down, and unreachable. They don't suddenly transform into someone who avoids connection or walls off their feelings. What actually happens is far simpler and far more painful. After being constantly available to people who only showed up halfway, who pushed them away and pulled them close in cycles, who relied on their emotional generosity without ever reciprocating it, the empath's energy gets depleted. Their availability gets drained. Their heart gets tired. And eventually, what people interpret as becoming avoidant is really the empath refusing to be accessible to those who have proven they don't value the access. This shift is not a personality change. It is a survival shift. The empath doesn't suddenly lose their softness or their depth. They simply learn to protect it. Every unanswered question, every half-hearted apology, every moment where they had to suppress their needs to keep the peace becomes another lesson. And these lessons accumulate until the empath finally realizes being constantly available to someone who is emotionally absent is self-abandonment. That is the moment the role reversal begins. After too many emotional withdrawals with no deposits, the empath starts adapting. They learn the avoidance language, not because it aligns with their nature, but because it's the only language that stops the cycle of emotional depletion. They learn distance, but not the cold kind. It's the distance that says, I choose myself this time. They learn stillness, the kind that doesn't rush to fix, doesn't chase clarity, doesn't over-explain their worth. They learn self-preservation, not as a defense against love, but as a defense against the wrong kind of love. This transformation is subtle. The empath doesn't slam doors. They gently close them. They don't announce their boundaries. They simply stop allowing them to be crossed. They don't argue for respect. They just stop participating where it's missing. What looks like avoidance from the outside is actually the empath reclaiming their energy, their peace, and their emotional bandwidth. People often misunderstand this shift because they're used to the empath overextending, over understanding, and over caring. So when the empath finally steps back, people call it avoidance. But the truth is, the empath is not avoiding connection. They are avoiding depletion. They are avoiding patterns that left them empty. They are avoiding relationships where they were present and the other person was only partially there. This is not who the empath wanted to become. It's who they were forced to become after being emotionally stretched to their breaking point. Avoidance didn't teach them to run. They taught them that being constantly available is a role that will drain you dry if you're not careful. And so the empath learns. They evolve. They withdraw, not from love, but from those who misused it. They didn't become avoidant. They became unavailable to the people who never valued their availability in the first place. When the empath stops overextending, the avoidant loses their emotional hiding place. Avoidants rarely operate in full emotional visibility. They survive through distance, avoidance, and silence, not because they don't feel, but because feeling too much overwhelms them. And for a long time, the empath unknowingly becomes their shield. The empath's constant giving, constant initiating, constant repairing creates a soft cushion that allows the avoidant to exist without ever fully showing up. The empath becomes the emotional cover that hides the avoidant's fear, insecurity, and inability to step forward. As long as the empath is overextending, the avoidant never has to stretch. As long as the empath is filling in the gaps, the avoidant never has to acknowledge the spaces they left empty. But the moment the empath stops overextending, when they pull back their emotional labor, when they stop rescuing the connection, when they refuse to be the one holding everything together, the avoidance hiding place vanishes. All the emotional gaps the empath used to fill become painfully visible. And for the first time, the avoidant must face the truth of their own absence. Avoidants are comfortable in dynamics where the other person compensates for their emotional distance. They depend on the empath's strength, openness, and vulnerability to create the illusion of connection without having to risk anything themselves. But once the empath steps back, the avoidant can no longer blend into the background. The silence they're used to creating now echoes back at them. The distance they rely on for safety suddenly feels like isolation. The emotional avoidance they believed was protection begins to feel like exposure because without the empath cushioning everything, their patterns are no longer hidden, they're highlighted. The empath's withdrawal forces the avoidant into a confrontation they've avoided their entire lives, a confrontation with their own emotional responsibility. When the empath stops mediating, the avoidant feels the weight of the conversations they didn't have, the intimacy they withheld, the chances they didn't take, the reassurance they never offered. The avoidant begins to see the emotional labor the empath carried quietly, the effort they mistook as natural, the love they assumed would always be there. And this is where the shift becomes powerful. The avoidance hiding place wasn't just silence, it was the empath doing the emotional heavy lifting. The empath was the one who initiated the repair, softened the conflicts, explained the feelings, made the connection feel safe. When that disappears, the avoidant must either step forward or watch the connection collapse. This is the moment where avoidance no longer works as a strategy. The emotional wall they built becomes a cage. The distance they used as protection starts to feel like punishment. And it's not because the empath wants to punish them. It's because the empath is tired. They are no longer willing to compensate for someone else's emotional absence. They are no longer willing to carry a relationship alone. When they stop overextending, they reclaim their energy, their dignity, their boundaries, and in doing so, they expose the truth the avoidant has been hiding from. That without the empath's effort, the avoidant has nothing to stand behind. Suddenly, the avoidant has to face themselves. And for many, that is the first moment they understand what real accountability feels like. Empaths don't shut down randomly. They shut down after being the only open one for too long. People often assume empaths suddenly become distant, cold, or unresponsive. They think it's an abrupt change, a sudden shift, a switch flipped overnight. But that's the biggest misunderstanding of all. An empath's shutdown is never random. It is the end result of a slow, almost invisible draining. It happens quietly, subtly, in small, repeated moments where their emotional openness is met with dismissal instead of understanding, deflection instead of presence, silence instead of reciprocity. It's 1,000 little cuts that eventually bleed into one truth. I can't keep being the only one emotionally here. Empaths don't want to withdraw. It's not in their nature to close off or detach. They're wired to stay open, to connect, to bridge emotional gaps. But being the only open heart in a connection feels like standing in a doorway that no one else walks through. They keep reaching out. They keep explaining. They keep giving second chances. They keep believing that if they just love a little more, try a little harder, stay a little longer, things will change. But over time, the effort becomes heavier. What was once natural becomes exhausting. What once felt like love begins to feel like labor. 1,000 tiny dismissals add up, each one whispering that their feelings don't matter as much as they think. 100 subtle deflections reinforce the message that emotional depth is something the other person cannot hold. The empath becomes the emotional engine, the pacifier, the stabilizer, the interpreter. They read between lines, they soothe unspoken fears, they carry the emotional weight alone, and as the emotional imbalance grows, something inside them begins to dim. Not dramatically, slowly, quietly, like a light fading in a room where no one notices until it's dark. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where giving feels like self-betrayal, where explaining feels like begging, where staying open feels like leaving themselves unprotected. It's not that they stop caring, it's that they start caring about themselves with the same intensity they once used to care for the other person. And that shift is often misunderstood as them becoming avoidant. But the empath isn't becoming avoidant. They are becoming cautious, guarded, protective of a heart that's been stretched too far. They're learning that being endlessly open is not love, it's self-abandonment when the openness is one-sided. So they do something unfamiliar, something they once judged, something they never thought they'd need to do. They withdraw to survive. This withdrawal isn't cold, it's healing. It's not emotional shutdown, it's emotional recalibration. It's the empath finally recognizing that vulnerability without safety is harm. It's them walking away from imbalance, not intimacy. And when they withdraw, it's not because they want distance, it's because they're done trying to create connection alone. Empaths don't shut down randomly. They shut down when staying open ends up hurting more than it heals. They shut down when love becomes one-sided work. They shut down to protect the parts of themselves they almost lost while trying to keep the relationship alive. And in that quiet withdrawal, you can hear the truth. They didn't stop caring. They just stopped sacrificing themselves to be the only one who cared. When the empath stops explaining their hurt, the avoidant starts feeling theirs. Empaths hold a unique position in relationships. They don't just speak for themselves, they often speak for both people. They translate emotions that avoidant can't articulate. They soften conflicts before they grow. They turn tension into understanding. They name feelings the avoidant doesn't have the language for, and without even realizing it, the avoidant becomes dependent on the empath's emotional clarity. The empath becomes the compass, the interpreter, the glue. But every compass has a limit, and every glue eventually dries out. There comes a day when the empath stops explaining their hurt. Not because the hurt disappeared, but because they finally recognize that explaining it alone is part of what's hurting them. When an empath goes silent, it's not the silence that terrifies the avoidant, it's what the silence reveals. Suddenly, the avoidant's emotions no longer have a filter. They no longer have the empath stepping in, smoothing things over, or translating discomfort into digestible pieces. The avoidant is left with the raw echoes of their own behavior. The distance they used to create feels different now. Colder, sharper, lonely, rather than safe. The quiet they once relied on now becomes the very thing that forces them inward. This is the moment the avoidant starts feeling what they've avoided for so long, without the empath narrating the emotional landscape. The avoidant must navigate their own. They have to sit with the consequences of their silence, their disengagement, their emotional minimalism. They start noticing the empty spaces where reassurance used to be, the warmth that used to arrive without being asked, the emotional safety net that always caught them, even when they never reciprocated the effort. Empaths don't withhold communication out of spite. Their silence is not designed to punish, it's designed to protect. It happens when they realize their explanations have turned into pleas, when their clarity has turned into emotional labor, when their attempts to connect are being treated like background noise. So they step back, they stop over-functioning, they stop narrating the emotional script. And in that stillness, the avoidant feels something they've never had to feel before, the weight of their own unspoken emotions.
For the avoidant, this is often the first moment of true emotional awareness, not because they suddenly understand everything, but because they finally have to.
The empath's silence becomes a mirror. It forces reflection. It forces feeling. It forces the avoidant to confront the truth that they were never the one holding the relationship together. The empath was, and now the person who held the emotional world open for them is no longer doing that work. What makes this moment powerful is that the avoidant begins to realize something they were never prepared for. Their emotional safety net didn't just loosen, it walked away. And in that loss, they finally feel the impact of their own distance. The absence of the empath's explanations creates a presence, one that confronts the avoidant with the reality they've been running from. When the empath stops explaining their hurt, the avoidant starts feeling theirs, not because the empath wanted them to hurt, but because this is the first time the avoidant has ever had to sit alone with their own heart. They didn't become distant, they became done. Empaths rarely leave with noise. They never explode, never announce the end, never turn their departure into a spectacle. Their exits are quiet, so quiet that the avoidant often doesn't notice the shift at first. There's no dramatic speech, no emotional breakdown, no final confrontation. Just a subtle, steady detachment that looks gentle on the outside, but is final on the inside. Empaths don't believe in burning bridges. They simply stop crossing the ones that kept collapsing beneath them. What people misinterpret as distance is actually emotional completion. The empath reaches a point where they are no longer fighting for reassurance, no longer seeking clarity, no longer trying to decode mixed signals or soften the avoidance fears. They simply accept the truth they've been resisting. This connection stopped nourishing them a long time ago. The shutting down doesn't come from a place of coldness. It comes from a place of clarity, a realization that continuing to pour into a space where nothing returns is not love. It's self-abandonment. Empaths don't leave when they're angry. They leave when they're empty. And emptiness doesn't scream. It whispers. It whispers things like, I've given all I can, and trying any harder would mean betraying myself. Once that whisper becomes louder than their desire to stay, the empath steps back, not to punish, but to protect the little bit of themselves they have left. Their detachment is calm because it comes after months or years of internal storms. They've cried, questioned, explained, begged for emotional presence in ways that were never reciprocated. So when they finally reach done, they have already processed the loss long before the avoidant even senses a shift. By the time the empath leaves, they have already grieved the relationship from the inside out. And when the avoidant notices, it's never during the noise. It's during the silence. It's when the empath stops reaching out first, stops cushioning the emotional blow, stops filling in the gaps the avoidant left open. The avoidant feels the absence before they understand the cause. They feel the chill before they realize the warmth is gone. And what makes the empath's detachment hit so hard is that it doesn't come with anger, blame, or accusations. It comes with a truth the avoidant never expected to hear. I don't have to fix what I didn't break. That sentence, unspoken, yet deeply felt, is the empath returning responsibility to where it always belonged. The empath is no longer willing to carry the emotional consequences of someone else's fear. They are no longer willing to mend connections alone. They are no longer willing to hold space for someone who never stepped into it fully. So no, the empath didn't become distant. They didn't suddenly switch shut down or harden. They became done with cycles that drained them, done with being the emotional caretaker, done with begging for intimacy that should have been freely given. Their distance is peace, not punishment. Their silence is closure, not cruelty. And for the avoidant, losing an empath doesn't happen in an explosion. It happens in a moment of stillness that leaves a permanent echo. Role reversal is the universe's last attempt at balance. It's rarely intentional, it's rarely dramatic, and it's never about revenge. When the empath starts behaving like the avoidant, it isn't because they want to mirror pain, it's because the universe is nudging the relationship toward a truth that's been ignored for too long. The empath becomes avoidant not to hurt, but to heal, to reclaim the energy they hemorrhaged trying to hold a connection that was never equally supported, to stop sacrificing their mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being to keep someone comfortable who never learned how to meet them halfway. For the empath, this shift is not about becoming cold. It's about becoming conscious. They see how much of themselves they have given away trying to maintain closeness with someone who fears closeness. They see how many times they overextended, overexplained, and overloved while the avoidant stayed behind emotional walls. And eventually, the empath understands something deeply uncomfortable. Their love has turned into self-erasure. Their nurturing has turned into neglecting themselves. Their patience has turned into permission for the avoidant to remain unchanged. So the universe steps in quietly, subtly, naturally. It introduces a role reversal, not as punishment, but as equilibrium. The empath begins doing what they once thought was impossible, stepping back. Not dramatically, but intentionally. They stop offering constant reassurance. They stop cushioning every emotional fall. They stop absorbing uncertainty, fear, and silence as if they're responsible for fixing it. The empath withdrawal becomes their medicine. Their stillness becomes their healing. Their distance becomes their recovery. And in that reversal, something powerful happens. The avoidant finally experiences the impact of their own distance. The avoidant has always believed that space equals safety, that walls equal protection, that shutting down equals control. But when the empath begins creating that same space, space without warmth, without cushioning, without emotional hand holding, the avoidant feels the sharp edge of the very strategy they relied on. What once felt safe now feels isolating. What once felt protective now feels like loss. The avoidant begins to sense the emotional vacuum they created because for the first time, no one is filling it for them. The avoidant notices the shift, not because the empath is loud, but because the empath is suddenly quiet. The emotional energy that once wrapped around them like a safety net is gone, and its absence becomes deafening. The avoidant is forced to confront the truth that closeness was never the enemy. Their own fear was, and now the person who provided the love they didn't know how to receive has stepped into the shadows where the avoidant used to hide. This is the moment where transformations happen, or endings. Some avoidants wake up. They begin to soften. They start reaching out, engaging, taking responsibility. The absence of the empath's emotional labor becomes the catalyst for self-awareness. They realize that connection requires showing up, not hiding. That love requires reciprocity, not retreat. Others, however, retreat further. They feel the discomfort and run from it, just as they always have. And the reversal becomes the natural conclusion, a quiet ending built on unbalanced emotional labor, finally returning to equilibrium. Role reversal isn't cruelty, it's closure, it's clarity, it's the universe saying balance will be restored, one way or another. Avoidants rarely change when they are held supported, reassured, or forgiven. They change when the ground beneath them, the empath, finally stops holding steady. Because for avoidance, emotional distance was never just a habit. It was a shield, a reflex, a way of feeling safe without ever having to admit they were scared. And as long as the empath kept showing up, bridging the gap and repairing what the avoidant broke in fear, there was no pressure for the avoidant to evolve. But here's the truth. Avoidants never prepare for. Empaths don't leave quickly. They leave completely. When an empath finally pulls away, it's not impulsive. It's not dramatic. It's not revenge. It's the final chapter in a story they spent far too long trying to rewrite. Empaths hang on long after their heart has cracked. They justify. They explain. They forgive. They pour love into someone who only knows how to receive it from a distance. But eventually, the empath's nervous system stops being able to absorb the hurt. Silence stops feeling like space. Distance stops feeling like patience. And staying stops feeling like love. That's when something irreversible happens. The empath detaches, not angrily, not loudly, but with a quiet spiritual exhaustion that says, I can't keep loving someone who hides from the love they ask for. And that silence, it hits the avoidant harder than any confrontation ever could. Because for the first time, the avoidant feels the absence they always assumed would be temporary. The space they used as safety suddenly becomes a threat. The distance they created wraps back around them like a mirror, showing them all the emotional labor the empath had been doing alone. They start replaying every moment they dismissed as too much, every reassurance they refused to give, every wall they built and expected the empath to climb. And the truth stings. The empath wasn't clingy, they were committed. They weren't needy, they were present. They didn't ask for too much. The avoidant offered too little. This is the moment the avoidant wakes up. Not because they're suddenly brave, but because they finally understand what the empath's presence protected them from. Their own loneliness, insecurity, and fear. And losing that presence forces a choice. Do they stay silent and repeat the cycle? Or do they step toward the person who stepped away? Not out of anger, but out of self-respect. Some avoidants transform in this moment. They reach out, they admit what they ran from. They attempt to rebuild. Others don't. Not because they don't feel, but because feeling without the empath's guidance terrifies them. Either way, the truth remains. The empath pulling away is the avoidance awakening. Whether it leads to growth or endings is no longer the empath's responsibility. They already carried enough.